Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is a standalone video. It's not one in a short series, but it is part of my larger suite of videos on game design. And in this one, we're talking about game progress and timelines. So I'm going to start talking about kind of the stretch of the game from beginning to end. We'll talk about various aspects of that. I'll look at some design questions later on, that are considerations you might need to think of if you're designing a game. So the first thing I want to look at is game endings and to examine a few different types of game ending. So some games you've got a distinct end, you have been set out to achieve something and your game ends. Mario games are often structured like that. When you've rescued the princess, you've achieved what you were asked to do, and that's the end. Some games have that kind of story end, but then continue to let you play afterwards and potentially give you more things to do to enjoy the environment and enjoy elements of the game. Grand Theft Auto games have typically done this, and you've got this concept of 100% completion, which is when you've done all the kind of the side missions and the pastimes and the random stuff in there as well. Um, some games, the thing that triggers the end of the game isn't necessarily one thing. So this is from Civilization 6, I believe. And the Civilization games typically allow you to set up games with a variety of different win conditions. But then once you get to that win condition, you've got a victory. Again, typically in Civilization games, you can continue to play afterwards if you want to. Uh, I've certainly found when I've played that when you reach a victory condition, actually you find that, or I find that I don't actually want to carry on playing the world afterwards, unless, I particularly want to do a complete world conquering. But if I feel like that, I usually set that up as the victory condition. Some games have no natural end, and pictured here is Minecraft, which is famous for all sorts of interesting aspects. And one of them is that there is no structure to the game in terms of things you are told to do, and then you have achieved something and you have finished. There are some things that you can do that can be thought of being as end game stuff, but it certainly doesn't force that on players at all. Um, and I'm guessing this is the same for many MMOs. This is certainly true for World of Warcraft. It effectively has two phases, one of which is leveling up your character until you get to the level cap, and then there's a whole load of other stuff that kicks in to keep you playing, which is called the end game. And this is obviously an important aspect of the way games work if they're subscription type games, MMOs usually are, is that you want the player to keep playing even if they've achieved what you set out for them to achieve, which is leveling in this sense. And in fact, in the end game in World of Warcraft, there's all sorts of other things that you can achieve. So the next thing I'm going to look at is game length. And games vary in length and play time quite dramatically. Here's a nice little graph of average game lengths. So credit to this will be in the credits at the end of the film. And you can see for different genres that the expectation is different as to how many hours the game might give the player. And it comes as no surprise, I guess, that at the right hand end, you've got things like tactical and simulation and open world and strategy and role playing. These tend to be the longer as well as the deeper kind of games that you can play. I'm a little bit surprised that the average role playing game length is less than 25 hours. I presume this is hours on the left hand side. I would have thought 40 was more like it. Um, but there are two things to say about game length. One is that longer isn't better. Uh, what you need to do in terms of game length is determined by many factors, but one of them is is thinking about what serves the gameplay and serves what you've got, but also understanding the expectations of your genre. So if you had an RPG that only lasted 5 hours, then you need to either signal that really clearly to players before they even purchase the game, certainly as the game goes on. Otherwise, they're going to be disappointed because the expectation for an RPG is that it's a longer, it's a deeper game experience. And you might well say, well, the game's just going to be as long as it happens to be, and different players will spend a different amount of time doing different things in the game. Yes, all that is absolutely true, but a good game designer doesn't leave these things to chance. So the next thing I want to talk about is the progress driver. So different games, well, we're talking about progress and the length of the game. Different games approach this in different ways, and every game that has progress will have one or maybe more of these or other elements that I haven't thought of uh, that are the core element where you can use as a measure of how far advanced the player is through the game. So this is basically a list with pictures of examples, and as I indicated, I think I've thought of most of them. I've certainly thought of most of the main ones. There may be uh, other games that you can think of that have um, different ways of approaching this, and that's fine. You've learned something extra. So levels. Lots of games, and certainly old retro games like Chucky Egg, one of my favourite games from the BBC Micro, was a series of levels, and this is still around. This is from Candy Crush Saga, and you have level after level after level of doing your crushing your candy. Um, for a lot of games, or certainly strongly story-based games, the progress is probably measured in terms of missions or quests, or how that's defined. Uh, so that is how you know how far you got, is how far through the missions or how far through the story you've progressed. Uh, for some games, it's spatial. Um, and this is an open world spatial thing. This is World of Warcraft again. It's a particular diagram that attempts to get all the different bits of World of Warcraft presented on it. And as you work your way through the leveling up in World of Warcraft, you move from area to area as and you find if you go to an area too early, it's too challenging and you get killed quite quickly. Sometimes you might find that you've skipped areas because you're good at advancing. But generally speaking, as you're playing through, uh, if you know the full kind of gamut of stuff here, you know where you're up to by which area you're in. It's also it's really level based, to be honest. Um, there's linear spatial, so there's lots of games that do this, and I've got a picture of Lara Croft there because the Tomb Raider games are ones that come to mind very readily when I think of this, which is that your progress is measured by where you are and how far through the world you've progressed. And the aim of the game is to kind of get from one place in space to another place in space through lots of challenging environment. And the original Doom first-person shooter, lots of first-person shooters do this as well. So it's a linear spatial progression. Some games have some kind of token that you might get, and that charts how far through the game you are. Mario games, and certainly the 3D platformer games, so from Mario 64 onwards, things like Mario Galaxies and Super Mario Sunshine and stuff like that. You unlock new areas by getting these tokens, stars, shines, whatever you're calling them in this particular game, and you know how far you've got by how many of these particular tokens that you've got. Player level, so the World of Warcraft is kind of very much tied to player level, but I talked about it as if it was a spatial thing. Here's my most recent obsession, which is Forza Horizon 4. Sorry, Forza Horizon 4, I should pronounce it right. And things are unlocked in the game as you progress through player level. It doesn't call it level, I think it's rank. It says, but effectively it's a level. As you do stuff, you level up. As you get to certain mileposts, it unlocks more things. And certainly through the early ranks and actually it does it. Um, you've got a global ranking, but you've also got ranking in particular aspects. So you've got a ranking um, for road races and a ranking for off-road racing and a ranking for dirt road racing, and in many other things. There's lots of different aspects to it. So it's um, not necessarily being a huge car fanatic. I've really enjoyed Forza. Um, so we're going to move on. The next thing I'm going to talk about is character progress. So you've got a concept of how you're going to measure the progress. You've got a concept of how long your game is. You've got a concept of where your end might be or how your end is achieved. And if it's a game where you're controlling a character, you may well have changes to the character as you go through the game. In fact, um, most games have at least some form of progression if they're based on a single avatar. So if you've got an RPG, the obvious thing is that you've probably got some form of player stats and got some form of starting level stats. Um, but then if as you're designing the game, you need to think about how these stats are probably improved as you level up. This is the fairly normal mechanic for RPGs. But as you're designing the spread of your game, you need to start thinking about what is the end product and what are a typical end game set of player stats. And as you track through, um, and you could create a timeline for your stats through your game to say at what level, what are their typical stats going to be at different points in the game as they encounter different aspects of the game or different places. You might not have the stats, but gear. Again, if you've got any kind of fighting game, you usually got some kind of weapons, and then you've got some kind of gear involved uh, with your weapons, and maybe with armor or some other things that you've got, which then becomes the mechanic for player progression. So you get better and better stuff as you go along, which makes the player feel like they're advancing and they're getting more powerful. So once again, similar kind of questions. What do they have at the start, or what do they get access to as they play through the game, and at what stages, and how does that map across the timeline of the game, and what are they likely to have at the end of the game? Um, Again, RPGs, some other games do this as well. Players gain abilities as they go through potentially. One of my favorite games for gaining abilities, I'm old, I'm sorry, I display it sometimes, was Donkey Kong 64 back on the N64. And this had a mechanic basically that you unlocked uh, Donkey Kong's friends or family. I'm not quite sure what. There were other Kongs. There was Diddy Kong and Lanky Kong Tiny Kong and Chunky Kong, if I get it exactly right. And they all had different abilities, but actually, what this effectively was a way of unlocking different abilities as you progress through the game. So as you go through the game, you get these new abilities, and as you get the new abilities, that allows you access to new areas as well. Uh, so it's quite a sweet thing. And if you've got a story-based game, then don't forget the fact that you've probably got a character arc as well. So this isn't in terms of gameplay, this is in terms of the story elements. And if you've got the story designed for your game, you need to be thinking about this as well. And it's good to think about the the progress in terms of the gameplay aspects alongside the progress in terms of the story aspects, because it's a better experience if those two are tied in together. Uh, the stronger the better, in my opinion. Okay, so I'm going to talk about phases next. So some games the gameplay is pretty much the same all the way through. Some games go through phases. Some games do this deliberately, and for some games, this happens as a natural consequence of the game and the gameplay. So first of all, I'm going to talk through an example. It's a few years old now, called Spore, and it's a fairly extreme example of the idea of having gameplay split into separate phases. And Spore had 5 phases to its gameplay. It's still around. I believe you can still get it and play it. So the first phase is a cell phase, and you eat and escape. It's similar to another game called Flow. Um, and then you move on to the creature design phase. You've got a creature designer, which is, to my mind, the funnest part of the game. To be able to design your own alien creatures, and it's it's a really interesting thing that you can do. And alongside that, you have the creature phase, which has got social interaction. Now, actually, by this it means you've got other species nearby, and you can either befriend them or antagonize them and become enemies with them. I can't remember what the end condition is for the creature phase, but you then move on to having established your genes for your creature through the creature design and making changes, tweaking it until it succeeds at what you want. You then get that fixed, and you move into the tribal phase, which is more like an RTS, real-time strategy game, um, where you're playing as a village. And then you get bigger. So phase 4 is the civilization phase, which is basically a city builder. There's still some RTS elements in there as well. And then finally, once you manage to reach the stars, you get the space phase, which in which you explore and colonize um, space. And the advertising for this, when it first came out many years ago, made it sound like it was going to be a really interesting, deep game. And the implementation of it, to my mind, was somewhat disappointing. And it had a problem, which is that the phases were too different from each other. And some of the phases were more fun than others, and it depended on what kind of game you wanted to play. So, in some ways, it didn't work very well. Some of the games, as I said before, you have phases that happen kind of as a natural consequence. And Minecraft doesn't actually give you specific instructions of what to do at any point. But there is kind of a natural flow that some people will find as they play through Minecraft from a new world. You've got to start off by surviving, getting some gear, and finding somewhere that you can have as a base, getting your basic weapons and tools, and then uh, often you've built a kind of crude shelter, but then you spend a bit of time building a more sophisticated place to live as your base. You've got a bed, you've got your workbench, and you might be kind of building up various tools and aspects of that. Um, then you might be wanting to explore and see what you've got around you once you've got your base set up. And particularly you're finding resources. And after a while, maybe you're thinking you actually want to get hold of some of these rarer resources that give you helpful stuff. Diamond is the thing that you might be after particularly. So you're mining and you're trying to find a cave system and explore it, but you're digging down and trying to find this stuff. And then finally, if you go to these things, there's the nether and there's the end. And so kind of more advanced things that you can get into, which I tend to ignore completely because I like the building stuff. Okay. Another game that has the potential for natural phases is Civilization. Different people play in different ways, I know. Here's the way that I tend to play when I start a new Civilization game, which is explore. The first thing I want to do is find as much of the world as possible, as quickly as possible. And then I want to expand because my theory is that the more cities you have, the better advantage you have, because you then have the ability to grow and develop faster than your rivals. Um, and then once you've expanded as far as you can expand, because you've come up across your rival civilizations, you want to advance your civilization as fast as possible to the best technology. And for myself, it's usually a race to get to gunpowder before my rivals do, and then Once you think you're sufficiently advanced, you start attacking your neighbours to try and take over. Um, and I know that it probably would be better for me to play all of those at once, and you do kind of do them all at the same time. But I feel like the way I approach civilization often goes through this particular sequence of phases. So I want to quickly talk about phased gameplay and some of the advantages and disadvantages. And once again, I want to say that although that both Minecraft and Civilization, these phases are kind of emergent gameplay, they're things that have happened as a result of the way that the game is set up. Um, a good a good game designer controls the game and controls the experience. So phases can add variety to the game. They can aid the design. So once you understand phasing in your game, or if you're deliberately putting it in, it can help you. Give you some hooks into which to help you design, particularly to design the kind of the stretch of the game timeline, and to think about what happens in different phases, where you want your player to be as they transition from one phase to another in terms of if it's an RPG level, or whatever um, your your progress driver is. Um, you can use it to show progress, or for the players to feel like they're progressing as they move from one phase to another. It feels like a kind of major milestone. However, if it's too distinct to change, it can disconnect the player and make them feel like uh, they don't want to play the game anymore. Uh, it's a danger point at which the player might stop playing. And what you really want, of course, is for all your players to play all the way through your game and then to become completely obsessed and to play it forever until you produce your next game, which will supplant it. Um, so you want to avoid uh, places where the player has a natural stopping point in terms of stopping playing the game altogether. Um, it can have effects on the core gameplay, and if the core gameplay that you like uh, is one of the particular phases, when you get to the end of that, you might give up. And um, I've mentioned World of Warcraft a few times during this video. I was an avid World of Warcraft player for about 5 years, and but I liked the leveling phase, and I wasn't particularly interested in the end game stuff. So I ended up with more and more characters that I created and leveled up, and I ended up in a situation where I had several characters at once, and I would alternate which one I was playing and have them staggered across the levels. It all got very complicated. But it's the change in the core gameplay that I didn't want to leave behind the leveling. I enjoyed leveling. Sometimes, as I say, they happen naturally, the phases, as a result of your game design. But understanding that that's how your game is a good thing. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is pacing. And this is kind of how the game feels as you're playing it. So, to give a couple of examples, Sonic games are well known from the fact that they're fast-paced games. Everything happens quite quickly, and it's meant to be a frenetic feel to it. It's you're constantly on your toes trying to achieve something. Uh, Stardew Valley, pictured here, is a much slower gameplay experience. It appeals more to people of my age, maybe. Not saying that younger people don't like slow games. I'm saying that older people maybe don't like fast games. Bit of a stereotype. And I like farming games anyway. But there's a whole lot of kind of gentleness and slowness that's built into the feel of Stardew Valley. And then some games are mixed. Most story-based games. This is a picture from The Last of Us 2. Have bursts of activity and bursts of uh, less so, quieter bits. So a good designer takes control of as many aspects of their game design as they can. So you can build in downtime for your games. I have a kind of fundamental question that I wish I knew an answer to, which is how long is a playing session? How long is it that a typical player will spend playing a game? I have a kind of natural cycle when I play games where a typical length session might be about an hour and a half. There'll be times when I play longer. There'll be times when I play shorter, and different games I'll approach with different length of time. And I feel like I've got a built-in clock, which kind of goes, that's enough time playing that game, and I might move on to something else, or go and do the washing up, or something like that. Right, so we're going to move on to some design questions then. So this is actually a sort of summary of what we've been looking at, but this has been turned into a set of questions you could use as a design tool if you're designing a game for yourself. So how long is the game? What kind of ending are you going to have for your game? What is the driver for progress? How is it that you measure progress through your game? For RPG style games or for other games that use these mechanics, what are your starting stats and your ending stats? For story games, what is your character arc? How do they go through the phases of the story? And it's a thing that is often said about stories, and so therefore should apply to story-based games, that the characters shouldn't be the same at the end of the story as they are at the beginning. The story should have an impact on the character, have some changes to them. Does the gameplay have distinct phases? And if so, what are they? And how much are you going to control that? And what kind of pacing do you want for your game? Do you want it to be all fast and frenetic? Do you want to have a kind of fast, slow, or is it all slow? Um, yeah, so there we are. So that was a run through of some of the things that you need to think about in game design when you're um, considering your game as a experience over time for your player. And that's it from me for now.